Okay, I think we'll make a start. It's great to see everyone here for tonight's seminar. The event is being recorded, and the recording and the link will be sent out after the event and will be available for a period of time. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting here tonight. I am on Gadigal land, and to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unbroken connection to this land. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Also to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people present with us today. Thank you. Welcome to this seminar, which is one in a series of professional development seminars that we've been running at the University of New South Wales in partnership with the Australian Association of Social Work, New South Wales branch, for social workers and other colleagues over the past couple of years. We've had some dynamic topics, and I'm really excited about the topic today, presented by Maureen McGinley on some aspects of her doctoral research on shame, which I think will have a lot of resonances for all of us across different contexts of practice. Before Maureen begins her talk, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Master of Counselling Social Work. First, a quick reminder to keep your video off and your audio on mute during the talk. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to type them into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat as we go along and answering where I can. I'm hopeful we'll have some time at the end for Maureen to answer questions, and if necessary, we'll stay on the line a little bit after 7 if there are further questions about the topic or about the Master of Counselling. So my name is Jane Mole, and I'm the convener of the Master of Counselling Social Work at the University of New South Wales. The Master of Counselling Social Work is a part-time 2-year advanced practice masters designed for social workers in practice, whether you are in a specific counselling or therapy role or in embedded or situational fields of counselling, where you're using counselling skills as part of a generalist practice or casework. Whatever your context of practice or years of experience, the Master of Counselling program offers an opportunity to enhance your knowledge and skills in counselling and therapy. One of the unique aspects of the program is that the academic staff who teach into the program are all experienced counsellors and therapists themselves, or have experience in their area of research. As the convener of the program, I bring over 20 years of counselling experience in government settings and private practice, and that I maintain alongside my academic role, where I teach and research in bereavement counselling and social work practice. Kerry James is an internationally renowned family therapist and scholar with a wealth of practice, teaching and research experience. And Maureen McGinley, who we're hearing from tonight, is a therapist with over 30 years experience and offers unique insights on the process of therapy as well as on her research. The Master of Counselling Social Work centres practice at the heart of learning and teaching through the program. You will be able to apply your learning to your own context of practice while extending your therapy knowledge and skills. The exciting news is that, as well as a yearly intake, the program is now taught in intensives along with online content, so that you only need to attend the university once or twice a term, but you still retain that really dynamic face-to-face content, a chance to learn from fellow students, learn with fellow students, and to practice and extend your skills. This model makes the program accessible for those of you outside Sydney or who may have caring or other responsibilities. We also offer flexible online delivery for those students who in the time of COVID, for instance, haven't been able to attend face-to-face. It's important to also note that the Master of Counselling Social Work currently has Commonwealth supported places available, and that significantly reduces the fees attached to the program. Our alumni work in many and varied contexts of counselling practice and are enthusiastic in their support and endorsement of the program. We're currently taking applications for commencement in 2021. Places are popular, so I encourage you to submit an application soon. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll be sending out further information about the Master of Counselling Social Work in the follow-up email after this seminar, and that email will have my contact details if you have any questions. I'm now going to briefly hand over to Marley from the Australian Association of Social Work, who is co-hosting this event with us. to say a couple of words before handing back to me and then Maureen for the talk. Over to you, Marley.
Thank you, Jane. I'd just like to say on behalf of the association, we're so happy to be bringing this event with you tonight, and thank the University of New South Wales for your ongoing support of this association. The New South Wales branch of the Australian Association of Social Work has had a really dynamic year despite the challenges of COVID-19. We are a group of members who represent you in New South Wales within the association and coordinate social policy and member engagement activities. An example is the fortnightly connected webinar series, which has given us the opportunity to connect with rural and remote social workers, something that's really been on our agenda for many years. The Australian Association of Social Work continues to be the leading voice of social work in Australia, and they're campaigning very strongly on the social work response during COVID-19 against the proposed fee hikes for studying social work and in the areas of disability, aged care, LGBTIQ rights and domestic violence. So I'd really encourage all social workers and social work students to join the association so you can benefit from the many publications, networking opportunities, social policy action, and contribute to the direction of the profession. This year, the National Symposium will be held online on Friday, the 6th of November. The theme of the symposium is promoting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social work, and there is a current call for abstracts. This symposium will be free this year for members. I'd like to remind members that voting for vacant positions, including the National President, will open this Thursday. Voting is really important in terms of the direction of our association and is now really easy with electronic voting. We hope you enjoyed tonight's event, and we would really welcome any requests for future events that you'd like to see. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks so much, Marley. It's always good to hear about what the AASW has to offer to support us, and I really value our partnership in this professional development program series. So I'll now hand over to Maureen for the talk. Thanks, Maureen.
Thanks, Jane. I also would like to acknowledge that I delivered the seminar tonight from Bedigal land. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants and traditional custodians of the land where I work and live, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I wish also to acknowledge that shame and shaming practices were and are used as a weapon against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to colonise and to continue to occupy this land. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. In therapy with survivors of CSA, shame is ubiquitous, named, unnamed, acknowledged, disavowed, bypassed, visible, invisible. Shame can be central to the therapy journey for both survivors and therapists. This talk provides a space to reflect on shame. We come together tonight with different experiences and contexts of practice. Many of us are social workers or training to be social workers, or others perhaps who work in roles supporting survivors in a variety of ways. I hope that this talk provides some points of reflection for all of us about shame, how it operates, and some particular considerations regarding chronic CSA-related shame and trauma-informed and trauma-focused interventions. I've worked alongside victims and survivors of CSA for over 25 years, and I've frequently reflected on shame and its impact. My contact with survivors has been in various roles: counsellor, refuge worker, a counsellor providing ongoing therapies to victims and survivors, so trauma-focused, and a counsellor providing generalist counselling where shame may arise directly or indirectly. And this, of course, is what brought me to my doctoral studies, where I'm currently exploring the lived experience of shame for adult survivors of child sexual assault. It's way too early to bring you any clear data from that process of speaking to survivors about their experience, but I might mention a few things as we go along tonight. Can I just check somebody's got their mic on, if you'd be able to turn that off? Thank you. And just one more thing before I begin. I would also like to acknowledge that we are geographically, emotionally and relationally in different places tonight around shame and around, many of us might be sitting at home. Often these talks take place in a seminar room, and that tends to contain it to almost like a work-like context. It's hard to talk about shame without reflecting on our own experiences of shame. That would be normal. But I just want to notice that COVID's brought all our lives colliding together. And so I encourage you to listen to yourself while you're also listening to me tonight, and reflect on what your needs might be during the talk. So many of you would be familiar with Brené Brown. She's the closest we get to a social work superstar, in a good way, I think. Her research has made a significant contribution to the public discourse on shame. Her original research, which was published in 2006, was based on extensive interviews, I think with over 200 participants. She's done many more since then. And it was the foundation of her shame resilience theory. Brené's famous for saying the antidote for shame is empathy. She has developed a number of accessible self-help books, videos and podcasts. And in fact, the other day I heard a comment that was, COVID has made Brené Brown America's therapist. Many people, including survivors of violence, abuse and neglect, find her resources very helpful. But what if the antidote for shame causes shame? What if to simply acknowledge this need to be empathic or compassionate toward oneself sends you into a downward shame spiral, where your response to shame is to experience more shame? Your thoughts are focused on self-disgust and contempt. Or even worse, perhaps, although I'm not sure, that would be individually defined. When this happens in the context of the experience of empathic connection with another, perhaps a social worker, a counsellor, or a worker in an organisation that has some power over you. This shame burns your skin. There is unbearable pain, and the spiral spins faster and faster and faster, descending into the depths of shame and the disintegration of self. The chronic shame, as can occur for victim survivors of CSA, can be a qualitatively different experience to the shame that Brené perhaps has explored so successfully. Very related and certainly intersecting, but qualitatively much more complex and much more engaged with the disintegration or the risk of disintegration of self. So what is shame? This quote by Kaufman, the questions of who am I and where do I belong are forged in the crucible of shame. In many ways, for me, this sums up two very clear dimensions of shame. They relate to both the I of who I am and the I of where I belong. Shame is an intense and painful emotional experience resulting from an evaluation of the self as defective or fundamentally flawed. A mostly wordless state. An intrinsic aspect of shame is the urge to hide or to cover the bad self from exposure. Frequently, when in shame, we can lack words to describe our experience, but associated self-blame and self-disgust cognitions form part of the emotional response. It's generally accepted that shame differs from guilt. However, that is also contested. But you would be aware of Brené Brown's conceptualisation that guilt focuses on behaviour. Whoops, sorry, that's my lights turning off. Excuse me a minute. That may happen during the seminar. I apologise, but the university has an environmental saving light program. So Matthew Gibson, who's a social worker in the UK, who has undertaken a number of studies around social worker shame, and particularly looking at social worker shame and the experience of shame in child protection fields, summarises how shame can be conceptualised as both a threat to identity and a threat to the social bonds. This is in line with Helen Block Lewis's work from 1971. Her seminal text on shame was based on an analysis of 170 transcripts of therapy sessions, where she identified that shame and embarrassment were more frequent experiences for clients than all other emotions put together. Unlike a number of other conceptualisations, Lewis puts forward an understanding of shame that recognises that it can relate and must relate to both threats to identity and threats to social bonds. So what you'll notice on the PowerPoint is a few examples of different definitions from each of those perspectives. Clearly in social work, we would see this as a relational or social definition or approach to shame. A little fun fact, Helen Block Lewis is actually Judith Herman's mother, for any of you who are aware of Judith Herman's work. So a little bit more on shame. It's important to notice that shame is different across cultures. For a very long time, it was generally accepted that shame was a universal emotion, which it is true. It is universally experienced across cultures, but it's not experienced the same, nor is it experienced physiologically. Nor is it experienced in a way where the definitions necessarily fit all cultures. So some very good work here by, and apologies if I pronounce this woman's name, this researcher's name incorrectly, but Seji Morinani, who actually discusses that while shame is considered to be present in almost all cultures, its characteristics and experiences vary. Noteworthy is the differences, especially in collectivist versus individual cultures. And shame does not seem to have a distinctive universal facial expressions, which is actually busting a myth that's been well established for decades, and is not experienced, sorry, I lost my train there. And for instance, in collectivist cultures, such as Mexico, Venezuela, India, Brazil, and Chile, there's quite a difference to how it's experienced in Western cultures, such as New Zealand, United States, Australia. Individualistic cultures, the experience of shame tends to be more, it's difficult to put this in words actually, and I'm needing to be quite careful here in how I say it, because I think it's what this article does is bring together a lot of different experiences that I don't want to generalise. I suggest that you probably look at that article more, and I've got a reference later in the paper for you to follow up, rather than me try and generalise too much tonight. Some other points to think of. Shame is often embodied. Now I say often because some of the people who I interviewed did not view shame that way at all. And I think I want to allow space for that recognition. Certainly, we engage in a number of physical sensations, but they are subjective, they're not uniform. And although there are some positions put forward that talks about a uniformity of physical or physicality around shame, I think that is disputed, or I guess I dispute it. I want us to be cautious about being too definite there. Shame is subjective. What shames me doesn't necessarily shame you. There may be things that as society we create as taboos, and frequently they can lead to shame, but not universally. It's important to notice that shame can also be adaptive. It can facilitate learning of social boundaries and acceptable behaviour. Here I'm talking about everyday shame, and it's important to notice that difference. Shame can also alert us to an indignity against ourselves and therefore be protective. We can become aware that we are being degraded, that a moral wrong is being done against us. And I think that this has a lot of resonance in child sexual assault and other forms of violence, abuse and neglect. Shame can also be adaptive because if you think, for instance, of a child, to not challenge, to adopt, what is viewed as a sort of a submissive position, a one down position is my preferred language there. When the person who is threatening you is a caregiver, is incredibly adaptive and a survival mechanism. Shame is also systemic. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Assault has certainly unanimously and irrevocably shown us the role of systems in producing shame, in prolonging shame, and in using shame to silence victims and survivors. And finally, I need to notice that shame can be healed through the repair of caregivers. Now, that is a key feature to the impact of everyday shame, if you like, the shame that many of us would experience through life, and the chronic or complex shame caused by or caused as a result of child sexual abuse. So just a couple of moments looking at interpersonal trauma and shame. Interpersonal trauma-related shame focuses on, I am sorry, I've just got a bit of a problem here with my screens, focuses on disruptions and traumatic severance of relational bonds caused by violence, degradation, betrayal, and defilement. So the traumatic shame related to CSA can emerge at the time of the abuse or at some time afterwards. I want to acknowledge here that not every survivor of child sexual assault experiences shame. It's very important to notice that, and certainly my talk is focused on those who do, but I want to acknowledge that there are people who don't. So traumatic shame related to CSA can emerge at the time of the abuse or at some time afterward. For example, a number of people in my interviews have indicated that it is with the growing knowledge of the taboo of CSA that shame developed for them, while others nominated it beginning at the very time of the abuse, even though perhaps they couldn't name it as such. They had a sense, almost an embodied sense, if you like, of that they were able to later articulate as shame. It's important to note here that some people in my study also talked about the adaptive nature of shame for them, and that it operated as a way to protect themselves. Excuse me. And this point you might be familiar with from sensory motor psychotherapy, such as Janina Fisher or Pat Ogden, who also discuss the adaptive nature of shame and the way that the body can store that shame if needed as a protective mechanism. So I want to move on to now just a few slides that are looking at the literature, and then I'm going to go on to talk about working with CSA-related shame. So in 2018, during my doctoral research, before I began interviewing, I undertook a scoping review of the research relating to child sexual assault and shame. I was assisted with that by my supervisors, Jane Moll and Jan Breckenridge. We wanted to know what research could tell us about shame following CSA and about shame's role in recovery. Basically, a scoping review requires identifying the relevant literature, empirical literature, so research, and the best thing about a scoping review is you can bring together the stats with the lived experience, if you like. So you can bring together the quantitative and qualitative data. And I identified 45 studies, mostly which were factored in the US, only one Australian study. And what I did was actually then synthesize those findings into different themes. And I'm just going to touch on them now because I think they help us understand just how significant CSA-related shame can be. So the first slide, the majority of studies provided findings relating to psychological effects and trauma symptoms. There's no surprise there because the majority of studies were undertaken by psychologists. And this is not a criticism, it's purely a comment that many of the psychological studies tended to focus on the psychological effects of shame. Some very significant statistical findings have come up from these studies. And in summary, what these findings tell us is that shame has a major role as a symptom or an effect, of PTSD or significant psychological harm following CSA. And it also has a major role in how significant the other effects of CSA can be. For instance, shame mediates the relationship between child sexual assault and PTSD symptoms. Higher shame also is associated with dissociation. Depression, higher shame is associated with depression. And in a series of studies that were also focused, so there's a number of things on the screen that are summarising some of those key findings. I won't go into all of them now. But what these really do show is just how shame is both an effect of CSA and also has a negative influence on other effects of CSA. This is partly why shame has been recognised as in DSM-5 as one of the major contributors to PTSD for some people. So another bunch of findings were also around disclosure. A very interesting and significant issue there was around the process of disclosing as occurring across the life course and the dilemmas for survivors, or the double bind that shame is both a motivator to disclose, partly in a sense I want to disclose because I feel I'm an imposter if people do not know what I've experienced. Or I want to disclose because I want to be close to this person and this is an important part of me. But the problem is also that it's an inhibitor, that in disclosing, in imagining disclosing, I'm imagining my shame and it can take me down a shame spiral similar to those that I discussed earlier. So there's also a lot of evidence to support that initial disclosure matters. If initial disclosures are responded to well and supportively, therefore the empathic repair by a significant other, then there tends to be a reduction in shame much more rapidly. what's interesting about that is those studies were focusing on disclosure, particularly to caregivers, but also institutional caregivers. That's a very interesting finding. So not only do what caregivers do matter in terms of family, extended family, but what teachers and child protection agencies do as the first points of disclosure also matter. Now, the last point, that shame can lead to a temporary reduction in shame, but it can also lead to a resurgence of pain, painful shame. Now that everybody knows, what will that mean? They must think I'm disgusting. That really picks up on a subset, if you like, of disclosure, which is relationships. Significant findings here around peer relationships and shame getting in the way. Relationships with non-offending mothers, problems with sexual intimacy, and some gender differences there too. And of course, shame challenges a sense of self. In fact, Doherty and Clearwater's New Zealand study was very clear in this. They studied male survivors of child sexual assault, and they adopted the term self as shame to encapsulate the pervasive and destructive impact of shame on the development of self. Self as shame is an incredibly powerful theme if you think about it, because it describes and encapsulates a painful experience of self in the world and self in self. There's really no escaping it. Lastly, recovery was the final theme, and unfortunately was the area of less research. Findings are very limited here in guiding what we should do to support survivors. Interestingly, and please bear in mind that there's very few studies that were identified, but interestingly, group work came out as in 3 studies. That was the strongest finding. Group work came out as a very successful intervention for both adults and children in recovery from shame. And so did interpersonal psychotherapy. The other findings here listed on the page were very much connected to qualitative data from survivors about what they'd experienced as helpful. But they came out of studies that weren't necessarily focusing specifically on shame. Apologies for the lights. Okay, so I don't think there's any surprise there for us. Safe empathic relationships, speaking shame, building a sense of worthiness, compassion, and community connections. There's echoes there of Brene Brown's work for sure. So what's the practice implications here? Well, we need more research. We don't need more research in establishing that CSA causes shame. We need more understanding of what might be helpful. But also we need to look beyond the psychological. We need to move into the organisational and societal and social systems of the individual as well. So again, I think this is why social work is so well located to do this work. You know, we hold the individual, we hold the organisation, we hold the social and the cultural in mind. And it's our capacity to move between those different systems, move between thinking on those different systems, that really is our strength and very relevant, I believe, to this work. So I want to touch now, even though the research isn't there, or not enough there yet, one could say, I want to touch now on trauma-informed responses. I've divided the next few slides into trauma-informed and trauma-focused, and I have a few other sort of additions, you could say. Now, I've done this because I think what I've identified is that There's some trauma-informed responses that are more universal. It doesn't matter what role you're in. It's a stance you adopt in your work that recognises shame and that brings an awareness of that to your engagement with people who have experienced violence, abuse or neglect, and specifically to survivors of CSA. So the first one I want to notice is knowing shame. Knowing shame and its effects. Interestingly, I think it's really important that we remember we have to know it in ourselves as well. Knowing our own default shame responses is crucial. Building relationship, core to any therapeutic engagement, whether it's in a hospital, whether it's at the front desk, whether it's in therapy space. And recognising shame. Sounds easy, right? But it's actually quite difficult sometimes. Shame manifests in lots and lots of different ways. We don't always know when it's present. I am going to just jump ahead and I'll come back to this slide because I want to pick up that point that how do we recognise shame within ourselves and within others? When shame can actually, if you like, the job of survival in shame sometimes is to try and push it away from us as quickly as possible. If we feel like we're disintegrating, then we need to recover. By that I mean we need to hide the shame or push it away from us in some ways. So Nathanson developed the compass of shame in 1992. It's been extensively used. I've borrowed this slide from the Education Centre Against Violence, just to acknowledge that because it was the best image I could find. So what this is all about is to avoid a shame spiral like the one we've talked about before. To avoid shame and to escape it, we react in different ways. Sorry, that is my timer, which for some reason I can't turn off. Right. We react in different ways. And we can react by withdrawal, isolating ourselves, running and hiding, avoidance, denial of the shame, denial of what's caused the shame, abusing drugs and alcohol. I apologise, I prefer using drugs and alcohol. Distraction through thrill seeking. We can attack ourselves. There's a high risk for people with high shame that they will self-harm or that they will somehow attack themselves. There is a suicidal risk for some people too. Or attack others, turning the tables, blaming the victim, lashing out verbally or physically. I find this compass really helpful to reflect on in terms of recognising my own default positions in response to my own shame and sometimes to the shame that I can see in others. And it's a very useful tool to reflect on further. Remembering, of course, it is only a conceptualisation. It is not a fact. It's a way to help us think about these things. So just to go back for a moment to the trauma-informed responses and pick up on a few more. I'd like to pick up on mutual empathy, honouring strategies of disconnection. This is picked up by Linda Hartling, who is a relational cultural theorist and therapist from the US, and who this is a main tenet of relational cultural theory and has a lot of resonance in working with shame. It's probably beyond the scope of the last 5 minutes or so to go into too much detail on that. But if you're interested in exploring the concept of mutual empathy and how it might work with shame, it's worth looking up Linda's work. But in a nutshell, I think what this mutual empathy really tells me and really is helpful for me in my work is honouring strategies of disconnection. A way to protect yourself from shame, similar to the slide I just showed, is to disconnect from it. And in many respects, we have to honour that in the therapy space because we are working to the values and the survivorship of our clients, whether we are seeing them in therapy or in other dimensions. So recognising that disconnection is a protective mechanism is quite important. I want to pick up here just for a moment. Often forgotten in trauma-informed responses is the role of organisations and picking up the systemic change that needs to happen in organisations. Gibson, in another piece of research he did with child protection, found that social workers didn't tell or were fearful of telling about risk or errors and mistakes in practice because they felt the organisation would shame them. Now, that's a really good example of organisations using shame as a means to control. And, you know, of course, we saw that with churches in the Royal Commission. One of my participants commented on the way that the particular language of the organisation where he was abused by a member of that organisation spoke, this particular language they chose was so shaming and minimising that this led to him feeling that he was making a fuss and that, you know, a lack of recognition of the grooming processes and the difficulty for survivors in articulating specifics of the abuse has been used by organisations to further shame them. And finally, just recognising resistance and adopting a dignity stance. Somebody told me that feeling shame meant they knew it was wrong. Not that they were wrong, but it was wrong. Now, that's a really interesting example to me, a possible example of resistance. And here I'm thinking about response-based practice, but also some of you might be familiar with Vicki Reynolds and other theorists who adopt what they call a dignity stance, a dignity-driven practice. And I think we can do that in organisations by imagining what we might like as a dignity response if we are that other, if we are that person we're working with, if we are that person we're responding to. So moving now just to a brief summary of some of the information around trauma-focused prerequisites for working with shame. This is picking up on the work of Patricia DeYoung, a social worker and a relational psychotherapist from Canada, who has written a very useful book. The reference will be on these slides. It's a very comprehensive book of working with chronic shame from a relational psychotherapy perspective. This is similar to some of the trauma-focused ideas previously, but just to spell them out a bit, I think what's really important is the degree to which therapists must know your own shame. If we don't know our own shame, we get hijacked by it in the therapy hour. She says that she encourages, obviously, psychotherapy, as many psychotherapists do in working in this area. But what's for sure is that if we don't know our own shame and how we respond to shame in ourselves, and if we don't move towards our shame appropriately, then we risk taking it into therapy. And I'm sure many of us would think of times where perhaps our own shame has crept up in the room. Reading shame theory is something she taps onto, but creating a shame-free frame for the therapy, obviously central to containment. She recommends the usual things around a safe therapeutic frame, such as clear transparency around pay, around hours, around how you respond to emails, etc. But it's interesting for me, I put that up there because I also wonder whether it's possible to have a shame-free frame, or whether maybe what we have to know and do is think about how we repair even with our best endeavours, how we're ready to repair when shame arises. She talks about choosing a de-shaming stance. This is an idea that comes from some other theorists working particularly around drug and alcohol work and domestic violence, where it's similar to a dignity stance, that we recognise the inherent dignity and we validate the relational experience from a non-judgmental place. That's not the same as judging a behaviour, but it's treating the person with respect. And choosing, I probably haven't got time to unpack this, but noticing that mentalisation and mindfulness also play a key role. Yeah, which I'll actually just pick up in the next slide just for a minute. So this is some emerging research from Brisbane, in fact, by Lisa McLean, who's looking at the role of compassion-focused therapy for working with sexual assault survivors. And hopefully that slide's come across all right. And, you know, after the talk, when you get the recording, I imagine you can look at this slide a little bit longer. But what I want to notice here is that, you know, compassion-focused therapy is viewed to be and was developed in order to work with shame. The tricky bit is it's a little bit like Brene Brown's quote about the antidote for shame being empathy. It has huge value. And Lisa is obviously demonstrating that in her research, huge value. But another study by Seji Mornani picks up the idea that shame fully mediates the relationship. Sorry, compassion fully mediates the relationship between mindfulness and shame. Now, if a person is too loaded with self-judgment, then compassion is a big ask. So maybe there's a step missing, and maybe that is where it's about some of the things on the previous slides, where it's about going back to the common factors, if you like, of therapeutic relationship and a systemic lens, but also going back to having an understanding of how to use yourself and what you know about yourself, and deepening your knowledge of yourself to benefit the work with the client. By that, I don't mean self-disclosure. I mean being able to imagine yourself and your relationship with the client, holding the client's experience, holding your own experience, and being able to be present for the client during your time together with them. So on that note, I'm just going to put up some helpful resources that you might want to explore further at a later stage, and hopefully I think you'll be able to find them just with the amount of detail that I've put on that slide. So thank you, everybody. I wonder, Jane, should I open it to questions now, or?
Thanks so much, Maureen. That was so fascinating. And I think there was, as the comments, there was some comments going on while you were talking, and I think people do have some couple of questions. First, are we sending the PowerPoint slides out with the recording as a video? We don't know yet. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Jane, I would assume that as it's a recording, it will be recording the screen as well.
Yes, and if not, then we'll make sure that the slides go out so you've got access to those references. So there was a couple of questions already in the chat that I might just put your attention to. Nichu was asking whether there was, you mentioned adaptive shame, and whether there was an example of that that you could give. I think you mentioned it at the beginning of the talk.
Hang on, I'm just, okay, so I think an example of adaptive shame comes to mind actually sorry, I'm just pausing for a minute to sort of think of one that I think, well, adaptive shame kind of has a number of dimensions. And one of those is that I talked about the idea that a child, when faced with violence or threats from a caregiver, will adopt a one-down position, and will do that throughout their childhood in order to survive. That's an incredible adaptation on behalf of that child. Of course, we recognise that in adulthood, that can cause difficulties. But I would also say that that idea around adaptive shame, that shame, one of the participants in my study said that shame is a reminder, even though she's managing it much better now, but shame is a reminder for her of that wrong that was done and how far she's travelled. And I think that is an adaptation. It's not quite adaptive shame, but it is an adaptation to shame that is quite helpful. Sorry, I should put the lights on again.
So while you're putting the lights on, Chris was wanting a little bit more information about honouring disconnection. Is it the same or different from acknowledgement when you were discussing those concepts around honouring disconnection?
Okay, so disconnection is about recognising that sometimes people need to pull back from relationship with you. And so it's a process where that person perhaps steps further away from relationship with the therapist or with the helper or whatever the context might be. And sometimes that can be done just through not attending session. Other times it might be done more aggressively, perhaps. But again, that is a way that the person has developed to keep themselves safe. And to, in the case of shame, to protect themselves from shame. Hopefully that answered your question, Chris.
Lovely, thanks. I think Alyssa just commented, Maureen, thanks for a really great presentation. I particularly like the notion of considering what we would like in terms of a dignified response and ensuring we respond in this way. And a couple of other participants asked about some more sort of practical examples of what we can do in the room to implement these sort of findings.
That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. I mean, certainly, I imagine a number of you have participated or attended training with sensory motor psychotherapists, because that is also an area, and mentalisation-based therapist. Unfortunately, I didn't really have enough time to unpack details of particular interventions, but some of the references I've put up will guide you to those. And I can actually give you some further references. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of clinical wisdom about what perhaps helps with shame. But the interesting thing is, and the thing that I really want to stress is, one size doesn't fit all. And I think we all know that, but sometimes it's difficult to remember that when faced with the overwhelming experience of shame in the room. So,
yeah, it sounds like there might be an appetite for a follow-up session on unpacking practical strategies as well. And yeah, I think you've packed the presentation with a lot of resources that people can look up. Anita was also just commenting on how she liked that we needed to know our own shame, or it will hijack our therapy sessions with clients, as I'm just picking up on that point. And quite a few people are saying, yes, follow-up session, please. Sorry, Maureen. Are there any other questions? Just as I read out another session, please. Great work, Maureen. Thank you. Yeah, other people voting for another session.
Could I add something, Jane?
Yes, please.
Something I really feel, and I think it resonates actually with a lot of the work that we cover in the Masters. But what I really personally feel is that we have many strategies, and happy to unpack them at another time, but many strategies around working with shame, but they exist in the context of a collaborative process where what we do with clients is we meet them and we collaborate with them to build and this, I'm not talking verbally here. Some of it would be verbal, some of it would be articulated, but we collaborate in that sort of space between us, as well as through dialogue, to build a unique response to shame.
Yes, I like that.
And I really think elements of that is about bearing witness and being able to tolerate the shame, thus mentalisation-based treatment. But elements are also so unique to that particular configuration of relationship. And, you know, even in family therapy, there's some excellent work in family therapy happening around working with shame as groups. So.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. There's a couple of just other questions as we finish. We've just got time for just two more. Nitu is asking if shame works in the same way when the adult sexual assault happens.
That's a great question. And thank you for raising that, because certainly I didn't want to give the impression that the only people to experience complex or chronic shame are adult survivors of child sexual assault. Because that's not the case. I think the reason, you know, that certainly with adult sexual assault, I've worked with survivors of adult sexual assault as well, and shame is incredibly complex. And depending upon the individual experience of that person too, and what's happened before and what happens is in response to the sexual assault, of course, it can be very complex. So these ideas are related to a number of areas, I think, or can be related to a number of areas.
Yeah. Thank you. And then just a final comment, I think, from Jessie. Maureen, the thoughts around your own shame and comfortableness with it within the counselling room is pertinent. Great point for self-reflection. Yeah.
And I just need to finish that answer there. I think the difference with child sexual assault to adult sexual assault per se is that it really is usually involved with the threat to your social bond and identity. And I think particularly when that abuse is in the family or it happens at a very early stage of life, the sort of configuration, and also sexual assault engages the body in a crime. And so there is a sort of confluence of a number of sort of factors there that might make aspects around child sexual assault related shame different to other forms of shame, but not necessarily completely different, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you. So just leaves me to say thank you so much, bang on 7 o'clock, for that really stimulating and considered and interesting talk, Maureen. It was really fantastic to see people's engagement with the topic, and I'm sure you will get more questions as people watch the recording and video, and we will send out information about how to get in touch with myself and the counselling team here at the Master of Counselling Social Work at the University of New South Wales. So once again, Maureen, thank you so much. And lots of thanks coming through on the comments, and thanks Marley as well for collaborating with us to host this event. I hope everybody has a good night, and I look forward to seeing you sometime in the future. Thank you. We'll let you know about the next events that we'll be hosting. Thank you.
Thanks.